We have for the men's race 267k course. It's punctuated mostly by a couple of short punchy climbs, Mount Pleasant, but there is Mount Keir at the start before. It really is a puncher's course, probably more so than, say, Quebec. Like, Quebec is 6%, Montreal's harder. This is somewhere in between when you dive into the detail.
On paper, when you see the profile, looks like it's flat with a climb, flat with a climb, flat with a climb, every single loop, but there's more to that. The effect on the race will happen in the attrition of those multiple Mount Pleasant loops. 12 of these loops, 17 kilometers for each. The first 7 kilometers of these 17, there's like not that much to work with if you want to attack or something. It's pretty flat. It's not completely flat, but pretty flat. But there's lots of like roundabouts and sharp 90-degree corners. I think there's like 10 roundabouts or something and 10 sharp corners. So that's quite a bit in the span of 7 kilometers. That's quite technical, but like you mentioned for the time trial as well, these roads are a bit wider in Australia than in the likes of a Belgian wasteland like where I live,
Like
for example. I was more leaning towards West Flanders, but okay, I'll take it. Now, after those 7 kilometers, that's where we get to the middle section of this loop. That's the harder section where, on paper, 1 climb, but in reality, it's kind of 3 climbs. We've got, first of all, Mount Owsley, steady 600 meters at 7.2% just before Mount Pleasant. Then we see, for example, Mount Pleasant just after that Mount Owsley, slight descent, then Mount Pleasant. That's the harder one. It's set to be 900 meters at like 7 point whatever percent, but it's more towards 9% really. So it's harder than the original profile. Up to 15% steep sections at the start of Mount Pleasant. The middle kind of is more gentle, 6 to 7%, and then towards the end there's like a 200 meter area where it ramps up again above 10%. So the climb is like split in 3 parts. First part hardest, middle gentle, last part pretty hard as well. There's like this small peak in the descent and loads of momentum on that 100 meters 10% section where I'm not sure how much effect that is going to have. And after that Brokers Road uphill section is basically downhill towards the latter part of this race, and there most of it is small ups and downs with like a bridge to launch from with like 4k to go or something. That's basically the notable parts of this loop. So if you go through this loop, you see that it's split in 3 parts. You've got the initial 7 kilometers, the climbing section in the middle, and then some ups and downs with a flatter part in there as well in the latter portion as well. When you see this loop, like, does it remind you of previous World Championships? You mentioned, like, for example, Montreal and Quebec and so forth. What races does this profile look like the most for you? And does that have indications to certain riders doing better than others?
I would say it reminds me of Imola the most out of recent course or World Championships. Imola had a little bit more climbing per kilometre, but it wasn't that technical either. I think, yeah, with the final climb 8Ks from the finish, it just looks like an Alaphilippe launch pad. Yeah, France have a pretty strong team for it. They get an extra spot because Alaphilippe's the incumbent world champion. He's obviously here. His condition, bit unsure. He looked good in the Vuelta, but then he crashed out. Christophe Laporte here. Seneschal Pache looked very good in the Vuelta. I picked him for half the stages. Obviously, I'll pair them with another team not wanting a sprint. Italy, Rota, Baggioli, Bettiol, Trentin, as well as, who's another punchy team? Slovenia, Tratnik, Polonc, Novak, and Pogačar. So not too many teams wanting it to be kept together, Benji. And there's teams like that wanting to be aggressive. What do you think the French team strategy should be when Cosnefroid just won Quebec, and Christophe Laporte's been one of the best riders of the world this year?
I think Veuclair, the coach of the French team, has a pretty difficult task to make. I think he's good at tactics, though, because if you look at last year, wasn't he the coach that had the French team at the initial parts of the section use Cosnefroid to lure Evenepoel out of his den and try to make him make early moves to make sure that he wasn't playing a role in the final? Because I swear the French team played on that and played perfectly into that, to the point where Alaphilippe could benefit of having weaker Belgians. Well, weaker, you know what I mean, like less Belgians in the final as a consequence, because if he thinks that far forward in that race last year, he must have a proper plan for this year. But when it comes to the French team, the all-out leaders for me are still Cosnefroid, Alaphilippe. And when it comes to Laporte, I'm low-key disappointed in Montreal for him. I feel like he was out early, but he was spent early as a domestique. Do you think that Laporte being out early in Montreal indicated something towards his World Championships where he does not necessarily deserve a full leadership?
Nah, I think it was much hillier. I
Mm-hmm.
think Quebec, he was very, very good. Also, he was used in Montreal to pull back Leknesund really fast, too fast, in fact. I think he's a real threat, and you can play him as the sprint card behind and be happy with your groups ahead. Or if he gets in a group ahead, no one wants to
Mm-hmm.
work with him. He's going to be the favourite from most reduced groups unless they're Biniam Germay in them, like in Gen Wevelgem. That can always happen. But before we get into maybe the Belgian team, which is the big tactics question mark, mention our show partners Zwift, Z Racing, maybe Z Racing is, if you're in America, is from September 5th to October 2nd. It's a monthly series to get rolling in racing on Zwift. It's not just about rolling around Watopia or training. The best part about Zwift for a lot of people, the most enjoyable part, is the competitive aspect, and Z Racing is a great way to get into the swing of competing on Zwift. Thanks to Zwift, as always, for supporting the show. But yeah, the big question mark is what will the Belgian team do? I think the tactics of France and Italy and Pogacar, not Pogacar, Slovenia, but Pogacar is pretty straightforward. Go on the last climb and try and get separation, or if you're Pogacar, follow and sprint. Belgium, though, very curious team to me. Van Hooijdonk deserves to be there, 100%. Sturven, Lampard, Hermans deserve to be there. But then there's obviously Evenepoel and Van Aert, but Seri and Stan de Wolf and no Dylan Turns. It's just bizarre. Like Dylan Turns said he was happy to go. He was under no illusions. The Flesh Wallone winner and the best puncher, because if you remember on the last climb of Liège, he was gapping everybody. He's been left at home despite being happy to be a
Yeah.
domestique. And De Wolf is in, who frankly is underperformed this year on AG2R, like in Healy races, which he barely does. Like he didn't even get around Quebec properly, so or Britannia Classic. So he's there because there needs to be two Quickstep teammates for Evenepoel. There was the tactics disaster last year. Surely this year, because it suits both parties.
Yeah.
Evenepoel goes long, like in Liège, because that's what he's good at. Wout van Aert sits in and has this threat of a sprint and doesn't have to do too much. And you look at Liège, Bastogne Liège, it can work out that you go 1 and 3, or it comes back and Wout has to win the sprint and he's been able to sit in. That's just it's not rocket science, right?
Yeah, it's not rocket science. And if you look at last year, that's exactly the situation that was created. We had Evenepoel going really early then, so that was like the extreme of going early, perhaps, last year's edition. And Belgium started chasing it.
To me, it's very, very obvious. Second
Yeah.
last, Mount Pleasant. Nathan Van Hooijdonk does full lead out and Evenepoel goes. Or Evenepoel, if it's already split up before then, goes before then. And
Mm-hmm.
in a flatter section on one of those other climbs you mentioned, Benji catches people by surprise. And Evenepoel goes with 15, 20 Ks to go. Maybe even earlier because he's got Van
Yep.
Aert behind. In Liège, he had to go, I think, 15 Ks from the finish, maybe 18 Ks from the finish, but they had no backup. Alaphilippe was done. So pretty obvious to me. Sturven or Van Hooijdonk set him up. The one that doesn't set him up, or Quinten Hermans, will mark moves with Wout in the wheel behind, and Wout can even counterattack on the last hill if he's feeling good.
I think France in the European Championships last year on that Italian circuit is an example of what I think they could be doing again on a parkour like this, where they just set up a huge explosive lead out train for one of the hills and try to launch their punchers. And perhaps that's their plan for the last Mount Pleasant on this parkour, for example. And they've got the other riders to try and keep control of things, or even one of a Cosnefroid to try and go into groups with an Evenepoel going up the road. Although I feel like I hope that they make a wise decision between Cosnefroy and Alaphilippe, and I hope they have a good view on what Alaphilippe's form is like before this race so that I can make that wise decision. Because let's say that an Evenepoel goes up the road, what do other teams do? That's my intriguing aspect here. What does a France do? I think they can send a rider with them because they've got enough riders that can do that stuff. But if you look at Slovenia, for example, that is not necessarily a team where they've got so many multiple options. Like Pogacar is the man for that team. He's got Tratnik, Jaka Primozic. That's like BTEC, AliExpress, Primoz Roglic, I guess. David Per, Polans, Novak, or the domestiques for Pogacar. Is Tratnik your man to send with Evenepoel? He's like the only rider that I would say would be in that role because Novak on one-day races? Not the case, eh?
And it's not long climbs either. So I think sending riders with Evenepoel is actually a terrible idea.
Mm-hmm.
And people will do it, but if you do that and then you let the gap go and you hope the team that missed it, let's say Italy go with him, who else? Netherlands
Netherlands,
get Taco with him, or what? Poles or Mollema. Netherlands get Mollema with him. Tratnik goes with him.
Denmark, Court, whatever.
Yeah, and then Britain's left holding the bag, and they have to chase. And then all of a sudden, the gap's 4 minutes, and then all of a sudden, Evenepoel is still going to be much stronger, usually, than your riders, and he drops them on second last Mount Pleasant or last Mount Pleasant. You're now in a terrible situation.
Yeah.
So that's me assuming Evenepoel's in peak condition. Otherwise, I would just try and chase him, frankly. The Australian team probably look like they want a Michael Matthews sprint. He won the sprint for second in Quebec. They love the points. Bike exchange. They got Schultz, Plapper, Connor Matthews, Hindley, Hausler. Hausler, I thought was
Why?
well. This is the thing, Benji. He got stiffed for the Leuven last year when he was like a
Yeah.
top 10 classics rider in the world, and they didn't take him to Leuven, and now they bring him to this. And no offense to like we like Henrik Hausler on this podcast, but he's not had the same year this year as 2021.
Puncher
And he's in
parkour.
on a bunch. Simon Clark obviously picks himself, who I think will win. Mathieu van der Poel and his undercover, very, very strong Dutch team with Wout Poels, who actually at Andalusia very punchy this year. Bauke Mollema, Jan Maas, maybe the odd one out. Taco van der Hoorn, Dan Uhle, Pascal Encorn, who I think was not bad in Quebec for Jumbo, and Dylan Van Baal, who is like he's so underrated. If the race is over 240 kilometers, he is a different rider. Roubaix, Tour of Flanders, World Championships last year. I just refuse to count him out. And Van der Poel is, I mean, he's winning these these Kermesses. He's won two of them plus Grand Prix de Wallonie 6 days ago ahead of Biniam. So I think Van der Poel will win because Alaphilippe is a little bit less because of his crash, and MVP I think will be in pretty. His sprint will be good.